Thank you very much. I'm here without slides and notes, so, help me if it all goes hopelessly wrong. And I'm here just to give a talk about, actually, to be honest, I'm a bit of a fraud in this area because when I actually got my first job, there was effectively no digital. There was. I first used the internet weirdly when I was at university in about 1986, 1987. And then it was effectively just text. It was kind of news groups mostly, and I seem to remember sometime in 1987 there was a man in Connecticut who wanted to get spare parts for a London taxi, and I was able to help him by putting him in the direction of a firm actually only a few hundred yards from here which supplied parts for vintage London cabs. And at that time I remember thinking two things. This is absolutely amazing, but why is it all so ugly? Because everything was effectively just white or in many cases green text on a black screen. Now, 6,000 miles away or so, there was someone asking that same question, why does this have to be so ugly, to much, much greater effect than me? I simply went to all my friends who are mathematicians and said, this is amazing, why is it so ugly? And they answered me by saying, well, it's much more efficient that way, it saves bandwidth. It's just a very minimalist form of textual communication, and it would be wasteful to have pictures or typography or formatting or any of that kind of thing. I said, okay, fair enough, and I took them at face value. 6,000 miles away was a man who asked the same question, much better, but decided to do something about it, and that man was Steve Jobs. Now, the interesting thing about Steve Jobs, as you'll see if you go and see the film this weekend, or this evening, is that he wasn't actually technologically very good. In fact, the really techie, geeky people within Apple were often slightly disdainful and would say things like, Steve, he can't even code, which was kind of true, and you'll see this in the film. Steve himself, and this is possibly part mythology, we never quite know, always attributed everything he did to a single course when he was at college, which he stumbled into by accident. And it was, I think, a 1-hour lecture on calligraphy. And he always claimed, to what extent this really was the decisive moment, we'll of course never know, but he himself seemed to believe that this 1-hour course on calligraphy changed his entire life. Because when he then became involved in computing, he asked the same question I did, which is, why does it have to be so ugly? And he actually knew how to do something about it. Now, what's really interesting there is that what you won't be surprised to hear from me is I think it's really, really important that all of you should learn to be as technologically able as you possibly can, and that this will hugely enhance your career prospects and enable you to work, first of all, to work actually in very, very many interesting businesses, totally different businesses, everything from sort of, everything from transportation to retail will need tech skills. Okay? A huge range of businesses, all of them will value it. But my other lesson is that if you're going to be really, really valuable at tech, find something else to be good at as well. And that, I think, is the interesting lesson from Steve Jobs, which is that had he been merely interested in computers and known nothing about calligraphy or aesthetics or typography, the world would be a very different and, I think it's fair to say, uglier place. So what I'd just like to talk about over the next 15 minutes are what are other things you need to get good at. Now, let me explain this very simply in kind of almost in game theory terms, okay? Lots and lots of people at school encourage you in the idea that you should be really, really good at one thing. I actually think that's a bit of a mistake, okay? If you play tennis and you're a really good tennis player, everybody aims to be the greatest tennis player in the world. If I'm going to be a bit cynical for a second, if that's your aim, you're almost certainly going to fail, because you're up against about 10 million other people who also want that, and the odds are that one of the others is going to succeed, not necessarily because actually they're a better tennis player than you, it might just be luck. You happen to be injured at a crucial point in your career, something goes, just goes wrong with a tendon at a key moment, and you're set back 6 months and you can never recover. Okay? It's a big risk. If you want to sort of future-proof your skills, be good at two things. Because if you're pretty good at two related things, you'll actually work out much more unique and much more marketable as a talent than being really good at one thing. Because there are already loads of people who are trying to be really good at one thing. Being pretty good at two things, and two things that most people are, where most people aren't good at both. A, you future-proofed yourself a bit because actually you have two areas of expertise. And also, you actually are much more likely to be unique and indispensable that way than you are doing something and competing in something where lots of other people are trying to do the same thing. So you might hear, it's occasionally called, people were talking about T-shaped skills, where people have breadth and in lots of things and depth in one. That's a phrase you occasionally hear in HR. There are more trendy phrases now like M-shaped skills and inverted U-shaped skills, where people have depth in two things and then a degree of breadth across others. It isn't just about being really, really good at one thing. And the most interesting areas, I think, of academic progress are often areas where two overlapping areas of academic study have actually collided one into the other. And the combination of those things produces some third thing, which is much more interesting than anything found individually in those two studies. And this often happens if you look at really interesting innovations. They're quite often the collision of two things. In the case of Apple, it was someone actually understanding that good technology need to be married to good design and good psychology before it could become anything more than a kind of niche fad. So what I'm going to talk about fairly shortly is just a few things which I think are just useful for people to know a bit about, at least. One of them, and it won't surprise anybody who knows me to hear this, is behavioral science, behavioral economics, or behavioral psychology. Actually, it's one thing to be really, really good at developing technological solutions, but the solutions won't be really very good if you don't know what part of the human brain they're actually there to satisfy. And the example I always give, there's a huge tendency for people to actually attribute to technology things which I consider to be psychological hacks. I mean, you're all probably a bit young to use Uber or Halo or any of the taxi apps in London. My contention is that everybody always writes about them as if they're a really disruptive idea. This new, The Economist always likes to present it as kind of technological disruption. My view is it's a really, really simple piece of psychological insight which they achieved accidentally. Very simple thing about the human brain, we really, really hate uncertainty, okay? We really, really hate not knowing. There's a theory actually that people are much happier coming back from the doctors being told you've got a serious illness than being told there's a 50% chance you've got a serious illness and we don't know yet. And what Halo did was it solved that psychological problem brilliantly. What it did is it actually said previously when you rang for a taxi you had to spend 10 minutes going, where is he? They said 10 minutes, he still hasn't turned up, go and see whether he's parked round the corner, oh maybe we need to ring the firm and check whether the car's on the way. And we just don't like being in that state of affairs. It makes us feel kind of powerless and helpless and clueless, and for complex evolutionary reasons we really, really hate uncertainty. Suddenly Uber comes along and you look at the map and you go, oh look, he's over there, he's on his way, and he's going to be here in 5 minutes, he's just stuck at those traffic lights, I'll make myself another cup of tea. That's an extraordinary psychological thing. The single best thing the London Underground did to improve passenger satisfaction was the same thing. It wasn't faster, more frequent trains, it was putting dot matrix displays on the platform. We'd basically rather wait 8 minutes for a train knowing it's going to come in 8 minutes than wait 5 minutes for a train in a state of ignorance and uncertainty. That's just how our minds work. If you understand sort of 7 or 8 principles like that, you can deploy digital ideas vastly more effectively than you can if all you're trying to do is to make things efficient. Because the human brain's idea of what's nice isn't the same as an engineer's idea of what's efficient. Sometimes you can solve the psychological problem in a much more economical and efficient way than you can solve the problem with engineering. And just to give you an idea of this, I've had this argument for years with various people in transport, arguing that you can achieve about 20 or 30% of the benefits of high-speed rail, which a high-speed 2 line from London to Manchester is supposed to cost now, I think it's just 30 billion just to get to Birmingham and another 30 to get to Manchester, 60 billion pounds to knock about 35 minutes off journey time. My argument is you can achieve, and the other great benefit is added capacity on the line. And my great argument is you can achieve most of those benefits, well, certainly 20% of those benefits, or 25%, not at a cost of 60 billion, but at a cost of about £100,000. And you can achieve it probably in the space of 6 months rather than 15 to 20 years. I mean, I'll have retired by the time High Speed 2 opens. You know, one of the reasons I slightly grudge paying for it, to be absolutely honest. You know, I might as well just shower cash on young people to achieve the same effect. But never mind. So my argument is, very simply, when I travel to Manchester, which I do about 8 times a year, I guess, I buy a ticket in advance, because you all do, right? Because it's much cheaper. Okay? And you buy an advance ticket, but you have to be really sure you don't miss that train, because if you miss that train, your whole ticket is void and you have to buy another one. So you leave a large margin of error and you turn up at Euston Station about 45 minutes before the train leaves, and in the time you're waiting for your train, 2 trains leave, because three to four trains now, every 20 minutes, a train leaves from Manchester. Okay? And many of those trains will leave half full. I said, all you need to do is create an app where I press a button and say, I'm at Euston now, and Virgin Trains can simply say to me, if you want to pay us £3, you can get on the train that leaves in 3 minutes, because seat J8 is free. What you've done is you've actually reduced my journey time by 40 minutes, and you've also massively increased capacity. I won't go into the details about why you've increased capacity. Basically, if you can get every train to leave pretty much full, rather than some trains being half full and some trains being overcrowded, it hugely helps capacity. In yield management terms, you should always allow people to travel on an earlier train if there's a seat empty, because it gives you a second chance to sell the seat that I've vacated, if you see what I mean. Okay? It's true of all perishable goods, which include things like newspapers and fruit and rail tickets and concert tickets. Once the date's gone, the good's worthless. That's what a perishable good is. And so you should always allow people to travel earlier. If you'd simply look at problems differently, if you look at the problem like an engineer, you'll always ask the question, how can we make this more efficient? And the answer to the engineering question is always, you make the journey shorter, you make the trains faster. You have more trains, so you have more capacity. If you look at a question through the lens of, say, behavior, or you look at the question through the lens of psychology, you come up with a very different answer, and it's mostly much cheaper than the engineering solution. Uber, to some extent, I don't think they did this on purpose. I think it was an accident. They just solved the psychological problem of waiting for a taxi. I think behaviourally, if you look at rail travel, you will come up with totally different solutions if you look at it through a behavioural lens versus looking at it through an engineering lens. I'd go a bit further and say, actually, you're making a mistake building a high-speed rail line between London and Manchester for a very interesting reason, which is if you disaggregate passengers, if you stop pretending that passengers are like atoms and your job is just to transfer these atoms from one place to another, my argument is that actually you're much better off building High Speed 3, which is a railway line connecting the cities of the north. And the reason is that actually one of the reasons we don't go to Manchester very often, is there anybody here who goes to Manchester more than 3 times a year? Probably 2 people. Nobody? Nobody. Okay? Now, the reason you don't do it is it's a long way away, and therefore the journey is expensive. There may be other reasons as well, like not wanting to go there at all, okay? But nonetheless, you won't make the journey all that often. If you go, let's say at the most, 14 times a year, saving half an hour 14 times a year is not that big a deal. It doesn't change your behaviour. Nobody ever gets up in the morning and says, I would go to Manchester today, but it takes 30 minutes too long. Okay. Now, if you build High Speed 1 or you build High Speed 3, you enable people to commute between Manchester and Leeds, for example. Now, saving 30 minutes a day, or saving 30 minutes 500 times a year, if you're doing that journey as a commuter, that's a really big deal. That means you actually don't need to move house. It means your spouse can get a job somewhere else. It makes a huge difference. So the mistake that engineers are often doing is they're looking at the system in aggregate and treating all human beings as identical, rather than actually looking at it from a behavioural lens or a psychological lens. So what I'd just like to say is that the way I always, to use a transport metaphor to explain this, and my apologies to the people watching this who don't actually, actually I better test the technology by just walking into a different quadrant briefly, hadn't I? Just so people get an opportunity to see this isn't just some sort of scam. Apologies for using a bit of a London metaphor here, okay? There are certain problems which I call South London problems. Now, just to explain what I mean by this. Most people who live in London, and you'll be familiar with this if you live anywhere else, when you get down to London, you need to get around and you use the tube map. Okay? And the tube map, actually, there's some distortions in the tube map. If you ever get into Paddington and you want to get to the Central Line, actually walk to Lancaster Gate. Don't take the Circle Line round to Notting Hill Gate. Because it's not actually a map, the tube map. We call it a map. It's actually a schematic diagram. Okay? It's not geographically accurate. And there are quite a few cases where what looks like a sensible journey on the tube map actually is a really silly journey in real life. Okay? You know, taking the tube from, say, Charing Cross to Embankment would be about as extremely dumb as you could possibly do. They're actually about 300 yards apart. Now, what everybody does when they arrive in London is they think, well, I need a map to understand this place because it's doing my head in, so I'm going to use the tube map. And a lot of the time, it's a pretty good thing to do. You won't go hideously wrong, with one exception. South of the river, the tube map is absolutely useless because most of the transportation south of the river isn't tube tracks, it's railways. And the tube map doesn't show railways. In fact, it didn't show when the overground was defined as a railway, not as part of the London tube network. It already existed for years, but nobody ever used it because it wasn't on the map. Okay? When they put that thing on the map, usage of what was Silverlink Metro and then was rebranded the overground went up 4 or 5 times in the space of 4 weeks. 400% increase in use just by putting it on the map. So South London problems are those problems where what I would say is the conventional map that everybody uses isn't very good. Of course, being north of the river here, you probably never go south to South London, obviously, and despise it completely. But nonetheless, if you should one day decide you want to go there, the tube map is completely useless. I mean, most people look at the tube map south of the river and go, I don't understand how you people get around. The reason is there's a completely separate rail map which shows that there are actually enormous numbers of railway lines. I was once in Greenwich doing an Ogilvy treasure hunt, and the next place we needed to get to was Charing Cross. And the weird thing was that everybody said, let's take the DLR back and then we'll take the Jubilee. I said, but there are trains from Greenwich to Charing Cross. The people were totally baffled. In the end, we found a station, took the train to Charing Cross, ended up finishing the treasure hunt 45 minutes ahead of anybody else. So what I'm looking at, where I think you can be really useful is if you look at the world in a slightly different way and adopt one of these disciplines, and I'd say behavioral science, behavioral psychology, I'd also include evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. If you can partner real skill in digital with the ability to look at the world in a different way to everybody else, you'll have a really, really interesting skill. There are lots and lots of people who take digital ability and marry it to the mentality of a conventional engineering. And there are lots of people who do that, and they're great, and they do a great job, but there are a lot of them, and lots of people think that way already. If you want to be able to solve problems really efficiently and really neatly, I'll just take my jacket off for reasons of heat here. If you want to solve problems really neatly, what you need is to spend a bit of time studying ways of seeing the world that are different from the conventional ones. So I'll give you a few more examples of this. Do you think that Amazon and online shopping in general will be the dominant form of shopping in 20 years' time? And most people, because they look at it like an engineer, most people think, well, it's more efficient for people to shop online, both in terms of distribution and price, than it is for people to go to shops. Therefore, the most efficient solution will always win. Therefore, what we'll see is that actually Amazon, which is currently, anybody want to guess what percentage of US retail Amazon has? What would you roughly guess? How many people would guess more than 10%? A few people guess more than 5%. Okay, about half. Anybody want to go lower than 2%? Nobody thinks it's low. It's actually 1%. Now, why is it so small? Now, an engineer would go, this is just a matter of time before people adopt the more efficient means of shopping. And they clearly think that online shopping is more efficient than going to a shop because they haven't looked at it through a human behavioral lens. They've looked at it just through a kind of efficiency lens. It's what's called mean field theory. It's, what is the most efficient way to do a thing. Now, if you think about it, the assumption is that there are two choices we face, which is get in my car or go on the tube, buy a hat, pay for the hat, carry the hat home. That was old shopping. And new shopping is stay at home, go to hats.com, or Village Hat Store, if I can put a brief plug in for a very good online hat shop, buy the hat, relax and have a cup of tea, and wait for the hat to arrive the next day. Okay? Now, if the world really were like that, then actually I think online shopping would be 20 or 30% of retail, and Amazon might be 10. Actually, if you look at your behavior in terms of the kind of path dependency, what actually happens is there's a prior choice to that, which is leave the house, okay? Leave the house, meet some friends, have a cup of coffee, have a walk in the park, go and see a film, if you're old like me, collect some dry cleaning, maybe buy a hat. Or stay at home and buy a hat, okay? When you actually look at the real choices people face in the real world, which is actually I can go out and do all these exciting things and maybe meet some friends and have a romantic liaison or whatever, or I can stay at home and buy a hat, then actually when you frame the choice like that, which is much closer to the real world decision, it's not quite such a slam dunk in favor of online retail. So what I'm saying, I'm probably conscious of the fact that I'm pretty much running out of time now. But there are a few areas where I think, genuinely, if you can take the best of your digital ability, but you can marry it to a slightly different mindset. So study psychology. Weirdly, I mean, my aim is that in 10 years' time, when people tell their parents, I'm doing psychology at university, the parents go absolutely brilliant because there are loads of well-paid jobs in psychology. The truth of the matter is there should be. I genuinely believe in the future, actually, that psychology will become much, much more valuable in business than it has been currently. Study something like evolutionary biology, because if you study biology, it helps you understand really complex systems. Ecosystems, the market and business is much more like an ecosystem than it is like a machine. I discovered this through working in advertising, where I discovered that when you talk to economists, they don't understand advertising at all, haven't got a clue. When you talk to biologists, they understand it instinctively. Why? Because actually nature has quite a large advertising budget. If you look at the natural world, it spends quite a lot of money promoting itself. The peacock's tail is basically an ad for the peacock. A flower is effectively a weed with an advertising budget when you think about it, okay? It puts quite a lot of resources into being visible and salient and attractive, a flower, because it realizes you could be more efficient if you were just a boring green weed. But actually, there wouldn't be very many of you because insects would find you totally uninteresting. Okay, spending a budget gaining the attention of something is actually a perfectly sensible thing which happens in nature all the time. It's only economists who regard it as inefficient and weird because they have a fantasy about perfect information. Actually, if you do economics now, you're fine, because the A-level economics course now has a large component in the UK of behavioural economics in it. Study that heavily. How people really, really behave as opposed to how they behave in theory is a really, really useful question. So that's my final thing. I've only given you a few clues. I've said biology is fascinating, design or aesthetics, anything in that field. If you think about it in a weird way, there's a brilliant man who made this point. He said that most of the jobs that people do now in London didn't really exist 20 years ago. Okay? There are a whole swathe, the majority of job titles, certainly around about half of them, kind of, web designer. A lot of these jobs didn't actually exist a short time ago. It's also true to say it's very difficult to predict what you should do as a field of study, because 10 years hence, it all changes. Someone made this point actually around the time, I suppose about 1998. They said, if you had two kids and one of them was doing telephone repair and the other one was doing graphic design, you automatically assumed in 1995 or something that the guy doing telephone repair had a job for life and the guy doing graphic design was going to end up as a bit of a waster. Then the web came along and graphic design became one of the hottest skills you could possibly have. So I can't tell you, because the world's just too uncertain and unpredictable, I can't tell you what to do to be successful, because by the time you end up doing it, everything might have changed. All I can say is that if you can do two things, you'll be protected against change and variation much better than if you purely focus on one. And if the two things are complementary, genuinely, calligraphy, who would have ever connected calligraphy and technology? But if those two things just happen to be really complementary to each other, you can really change the world. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. One more thing. There was a little psychological experiment in the midst of all this, which, as you may have noticed, has anybody noticed a change in the audience at all? If you look around you quickly, anything strange? What you may have noticed is when I took my jacket off, so did nearly everybody in the audience. It's a wonderful psychological experiment where genuinely you may see things on YouTube where someone's asking directions of a stranger and someone walks between them with a board, and then the person is replaced by someone even of the opposite sex or of totally different appearance, and the person just keeps on giving directions, having failed to notice the substitution. That's one of those interesting things. You can actually substitute things, and the brain effectively will do the job of just saying, pretend nothing's happened here, because I really, really don't like ambiguity and uncertainty. Understanding how strong that urge is pretty important. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.